In early June 1942, the 132nd Infantry Division was faced with its most demanding challenge of the war thus far. Since the recent winter battles, the enemy had been engaged in a concentrated effort to prepare and strengthen their defences, and had brought in fresh, newly equipped troops to reinforce the units that had suffered heavy casualties throughout their attempts to defend the Crimean Peninsula. The Soviets, strongly supported by supplies from the United States, also brought massive amounts of war materials into the assembly areas from the sea. It was imperative that the Sevastopol fortress, which was made up of a complex system of defences, be taken by the 11th Army. For the fortress to remain under Soviet control would serve to tie the German divisions to the Crimea at a time when they were badly needed elsewhere along the thinly held Eastern Front. The efforts to capture Sevastopol could not be abandoned, but had to be carried through to prevent its future use by the Soviets as a bridgehead from where offensives could be launched deep into the Ukraine. Once this penetration into the Ukraine could be accomplished, the Soviets would then be able to penetrate the German right flank and possibly sever the lifeline of entire armies that were advancing farther to the east. The Russians had long since held total control over the area with their Black Sea Fleet. Thus, this danger loomed over the German army in the Crimea for as long as they held ground on the peninsula. Regular bombardments from large-caliber naval guns at a distance of 20 kilometers from the coast had become commonplace, and until July 1942, the naval strength of the Axis in this area consisted of only a small number of Italian patrol boats in the harbours along the Crimean coastline. The position of Fortress Sevastopol enabled it to control the entire area of the Cherson Peninsula. Armed with numerous modern coastal batteries of heavy caliber that could be trained to fire on the landward side, the fortress was protected by heavy terrain from that side as well. In the north, the Belbek Valley provided a natural earthwork for the foremost defences. In the east, the heavy underbrush and thick woods served as a barrier to attacking infantry, broken intermittently by sharply cut valleys, gorges and ravines, often with steep, impenetrable sides that made large-scale troop movement impossible. The forces destined to launch the final battle for Russia's strongest and largest fortress were facing commanding heights that offered a wide view for the defenders and presented the attackers with the immense task of penetrating deep valleys, steep ravines and thick underbrush. Particularly imposing was the line delineating the north front, running along the Belbek Valley, with the fortress Bastion I, the armoured battery Maxim Gorky, and the fortress Shishkova. The Army Corps, under the able command of General de Cavalieri Hansen, was assigned to lead the first assault on the fortresses, with support from the 132nd, the 22nd, the 50th, and the 24th Infantry Divisions. Heavy batteries of calibers up to 800 mm were brought up and emplaced in preparation for the attack scheduled for the 7th of June. For 7 days prior to the attack, a barrage blanketed the heavily defended enemy positions, and the battery Maxim Gorky drew special attention from the German gunners. The 132nd Infantry Division, on the right wing of the Army Corps, was set into motion with the task of launching a frontal assault across the Belbek Valley, to take the Olberg under attack, and to push toward the southwest, placing themselves in position to storm the commanding heights of Bastion I and Maxim Gorky from the southeast. The neighbouring unit on the left, the 22nd Infantry Division, would be in position to launch an attack only after the successful capture of the heights of the Olberg. During the last days of May, the batteries of our artillery regiments were pulled into their new positions, which lay in the northern sectors. The following days, the ravines and valleys resounded with the low thunder of countless artillery barrages, continually pounding the enemy positions in preparation for the attack to follow. The batteries fired day and night on assigned sectors. The 5th Battery attempted to establish an observation point on the Koberberg, from where the Soviet positions in the Belbek Valley could be observed. The ominous droning of aircraft from both antagonists filled the air during the hours of daylight as they sought their living targets, and dive bombers could be seen periodically descending on the city in the distance. The enemy anti-aircraft positions were successfully neutralized through the efforts of the dive bombers and artillery fire, though with heavy cost to our Luftwaffe. Throughout the night, Fieseler Storch reconnaissance aircraft circled over the Soviet lines, and the Russians attempted in vain to illuminate their locations with floodlights, which often swept the terrain at a level low enough to reveal any movement in our ground defences. The activities of these aircraft also served to conceal the noise of our own motorised columns as they advanced toward the line. We arrived at our position on the 5th of June, hastily digging into defences at a distance of only 100 metres from the foremost Russian outposts. Our captured Russian prime mover was used to bring the gun into position. As we were approaching our position, we passed a heavy 600mm mortar with an extremely short barrel, and our investigation revealed a weapon that was new to us. The gun crew advised us that when the mortar was fired, the barrel would compress in a telescoping action to provide a recoilless effect. And we were told that the weapon was deployed to the Sevastopol front for specific use against Maxim Gorky. During its firing, it was possible to see the giant projectiles in flight, and the Lancers immediately dubbed them flying coffins. Our anti-tank gun was situated to the right of a steep cliff, concealed in a shallow depression opposite the emplacement Maxim Gorky. Throughout the previous night we had hacked a shallow trench into the rocky earth, the hard ground giving way only to the heavy picks that were carried in our tracked vehicle. The nights were of short duration, which enabled us only 5 or 6 hours of darkness, during which we could work in relative safety before we would be visible to the enemy observers a short distance from our position. The assault preparations against the coastal fortress neared completion. It was known that the fortress consisted of hundreds of concrete and steel-reinforced embrasures, belts of bunkers, armoured batteries, deep trenches, barbed wire and minefields. Situated deep within the cliffs were rocket launchers and mortar positions that could not be reached or neutralised by conventional artillery fire or airstrikes. The artillery, rockets, flak and assault guns pounded the enemy positions for 5 days prior to the attack. 1,300 guns opened fire on pre-designated targets and field positions. The squadrons of General von Richthofen's 8th Flieger Corps bombed the Russian defences mercilessly. The earth churned and was tortured in a murderous overture. Never before or never again during the war would the German forces mass such artillery, which more than equalled the 1,000 guns used by Montgomery against Rommel's Afrika Corps at El Alamein. The Nebelwerfers were assigned a special role in the assault plans. The heavy 1st Werfer Regiment, the 70th Werfer Regiment, and the 1st and 4th Werfer sections were attached to a special staff commanded by Oberst Niemann in the front before the fortress. 21 batteries opened fire with 576 guns, including the 1st Werfer battery with its 28 cm and 32 cm high explosive and incendiary projectiles. With each barrage, 3 24 rocket projectiles were fired per second from the barrels of this regiment on predetermined targets. The barrages served to demoralise the enemy troops, as well as to physically destroy their defensive capabilities, and both attempts achieved the same end effect. A battery of 6 launchers was capable of firing 26 flaming projectiles with nerve-wracking screams, creating a terrible effect on the recipients. The shrapnel from these projectiles was not as effective as the splintering of artillery shells, but the explosive effect upon detonation within a confined area or at close range would rupture blood vessels with a benumbing shockwave. The enemy soldiers located within the immediate vicinity of the impact area were rapidly demoralized by the ear-splitting blasts, and basic instinctive fear quickly gave way to terror and panic. The stoic Russian soldiers, usually insensitive even to the Stuka attacks, were often rendered stunned and helpless under these barrages. 3 exceptional artillery behemoths were sent into operation at Sevastopol: the Gamma mortar, the mortar Karl, also called Thor, and the giant railway gun Dora. All 3 were at the time considered wonder weapons of the conventional artillery forces, and had been designed and manufactured for the specific purpose of penetrating reinforced concrete bunkers and fortresses. The Gamma mortar was simply the Big Bertha cannon of World War I resurrected. The weapon fired 427mm projectiles that weighed 923 kilograms and had an effective range of 14 kilometers. The immense barrel was 6.72 meters in length, and the weapon was served by a crew of 235 specially trained artillerists. The Gamma weapon, in all its immensity, was a dwarf compared to the 615mm mortars Karl or Thor. Designed for the specific purpose of destroying concrete embrasures, the 2,200-kilogram projectiles were fired from a weapon that had little in common with conventional mortars. The 5-meter barrel and the giant carriage provided the impression of a wheeled factory sporting an immense chimney, silhouetted at an angle against the sky. Yet Karl was not the perfected model of artillery produced by our technology. The largest gun was located in Bakhchisaray in the Palace of Gardens, the old residence of the Khan of the Tartars, and was officially christened Dora. The Lancers referred to it as Heavy Gustav, and with its 800mm bore it remained the heaviest cannon of the war. 60 railway cars were required for the transportation of the separate parts, which required assembly on location for the weapon to be rendered active. A high-explosive shell weighing 4,800 kilograms, or almost 5 tons, was fired from a barrel 32.5 meters in length. It was also capable of firing a 7,000-kilogram armor-piercing shell, a distance of 38 kilometers. The projectile and casing had a total length of 7.8 meters. If placed vertically, the ammunition would stand as tall as a 2-story house. The maximum rate of fire was 3 rounds in an hour. 2 flak units were assigned as permanent security. The service crew, additional security and maintenance personnel for this monster consisted of a major general, a colonel, and 1,500 men. This obsolete military philosophy relied on conventional artillery pieces in a perverse giant form that had so increased in dimensions that they became counter-effective in terms of men and material required for support and use. Nevertheless, a single shot from Dora was reported to have penetrated 30 meters of earth to destroy a massive underground ammunition depot at Severnaya Bay near Sevastopol. Deep in positions well situated and protected by natural terrain, the Soviets labored on their defenses while they waited for the attackers. The fortress was defended by 7 Soviet rifle divisions, a dismounted cavalry division, 2 rifle brigades, 3 navy brigades, 2 naval infantry regiments, and various armoured battalions with independent units, for a total of over 100,000 men. 10 artillery regiments and 2 mortar battalions, an anti-tank regiment as well as 45 heavy gun units of coastal artillery, stood with a total of 600 guns and 2,000 mortars in the defensive line. These forces made up the enormous defence, all of which had to be overrun and captured or destroyed by the 11th Army, with a force totalling only 7 weakened German divisions and 2 ill-equipped Romanian divisions. We assembled at the headquarters of the 2nd Battalion, 436th Regiment, on the evening of the 6th of June, where we were briefed that the attack would be launched the following morning at 3 a.m. My gun crew was assigned to take a Soviet emplacement under fire that was situated half left from our position and slightly higher in elevation. The target was clearly visible at a distance of 300 meters from our position. We spent the night crouching under our shelter quarters in the narrow trenches dug behind our gun. In the early morning hours, while still cloaked in darkness, we shook ourselves free from the cover and warmth of our hastily improvised shelters, and in the crisp night air prepared to launch our barrage at precisely 3 a.m. At exactly the prescribed time, a massive crescendo of fire erupted from the German lines. As the sky in the east was showing the first hint of dawn, I adjusted the aim of the pack on the predetermined target and opened fire, shot after shot, alternating armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. Within minutes I observed a red flare floating toward the earth through the smoke and darkness to our left, a signal to us from our own forces indicating that the assault elements were moving forward. I adjusted the fire accordingly, so as not to engage our own units storming toward the enemy positions. Despite the coming of daylight, the visibility continued to worsen, with steam, smoke, and clouds of dust covering the target positions. An angry enemy had now been awakened, and we found ourselves taken under direct fire from the battery Maxim Gorky. Shell bursts of all calibers began to explode around us, including naval gunfire from the warships. Helpless to react, we could only cower in our shallow trenches, pray for survival, and wait out the storm. Countless impacts surrounded and seemed to engulf our gun. Shrapnel filled the air, hissing and whistling overhead. We were showered with hunks of stone and earth as massive shells exploded nearby, tossing brown-black geysers skyward and leaving us numb with fear. The earth trembled, dust filled our eyes. It became difficult to breathe. We lay motionless, pressed against the earth in our trenches, as rocks and dirt rained on dull grey-green helmets. Our hands were clapped tightly over our ears, and we squeezed our eyes shut in vain attempts to block out the unexpected horror that had descended on us. A member of my gun crew, who had bravely served through all our previous engagements, suddenly scrambled to a far corner of our trench, pulled his helmet from his head, and screamed over the roar of explosions, "I can't take it anymore!" Foaming at the mouth and his eyes wide with terror, he struggled to his feet in an attempt to spring from the trench. I threw myself on him and wrestled him to the ground as another shell exploded near the edge of the earthwork, sending white-hot splinters whistling through the air. Grinding his teeth, clawing and struggling wildly, he fought to escape. Rising quickly, I struck him hard across the face and threw myself on him once more. He lay motionless, staring wide-eyed at me, and I released him to seek shelter beneath the edge of the trench. He suddenly sprang forward as if possessed, and in one motion cleared the berm, sprinting bareheaded through the clouds of smoke and dust and disappearing toward the rear. We again dove for cover as the hail of shells increased, and we never expected to see him alive again as we pressed ourselves against the earth in an attempt to escape the explosions and shell fragments. Later that evening, after the guns had fallen silent, he reappeared at our position as if nothing had occurred, and the incident was never mentioned. The 5th Company, Infantry Regiment 437, broke through the enemy trench system at the point of the cliff that lies on the northern side of the Belbek Valley. Reinforced by the enemy to serve as a secure strongpoint, the deep ravines of the valley provided the enemy protection from our artillery fire. Fritz, a friend I had known since our recruit training in Darmstadt, lay with his group in an assembly position before the cliff. He pulled a hand grenade from his belt, jerked the priming cord, and tossed it over his head into the enemy trench before him. At that instant, a Russian infantryman opened fire with a burst from a submachine gun, and an explosive bullet tore into Fritz's arm, rendering him unconscious with shock. The accompanying Lancers stormed forward through the smoke and dust. Regaining his senses, Fritz crawled along the earth to the rear to report the breach in the defences. His grenade had killed the enemy gunner, which had enabled a small opening in the Soviet defences to be exploited by Lancers in grey-green, who continued to push forward rapidly, penetrating the enemy positions. The successes in our sector resulted in several hundred metres of ground won, while farther to our left, our infantry company was able to overrun the forward defences of the Belbek Valley. On the 7th of June, a full frontal attack across the Belbek Valley was followed in the afternoon by the capture of the Olberg, which resulted in heavy losses to our troops. Despite the losses, with this winning of ground, a link-up was made with the 22nd Infantry Division, and preparations were made for further advance. From 8 to the 15th of June, the regiment continued to press forward in operations that proved to be costly in men and material, each foot of ground being hotly contested in attempts to capture the commanding Neuhaus Heights. During this period, Infantry Regiment 213 was assigned to reinforce the division and was placed into action on the right wing. The Russians made numerous unsuccessful attempts to break through the lines on this wing in an effort to regain the Olberg. A massive attack was scheduled for the 17th of June. New fire objectives were relayed to the artillery batteries, and shells bursting on isolated nests of enemy resistance could be observed from the front. At 7:45 a.m. we received word that the GPU battlement had fallen to our infantry. At 8:30 a.m. it was reported that the battlements Siberia and Volga had also been taken by German troops. Following an hour of fierce fighting, our infantry breached the line of defence that had been established among primitive dwellings near Bastion Wurst, and at 8:45 a.m. the bastion was taken by the assault troops. At 1,000 the enemy batteries, firing from positions near Bartenyevka, were silenced as well. At 1200 our foremost assault elements continued to hold Bastion against heavy enemy counterattacks. Between 12:50 p.m. and 1:15 p.m., each battery from our artillery regiment fired 80 rounds on Shishkova. Still, the positions remained resolutely defended by the Soviet infantrymen, who refused to yield a metre of ground. The Lancers attempting to hold the bastion became engaged in hand-to-hand fighting during the desperate Soviet counterattacks, and the battle swept back and forth as the positions were captured, overrun, and recaptured. The positions were littered with dead and dying. The walking wounded staggered and careened senselessly through the smoke that engulfed the defences. The units of both antagonists became mixed inseparably as the soldiers shot, clubbed, and bayoneted one another. At 2:45 p.m., the position Molotov was reported to have fallen to our forces. Heavy Artillery Battalion 641 had been assigned to destroy the Maxim Gorky stronghold with two 355mm mortars that were located 4 kilometers to the west of the Olberg. These massive projectiles, weighing 1,000 kilograms each, were delivered to the breech of the gun with cranes. The mortars had previously seen action during the French campaign against the defences of Luetich. The projectiles were designed not to explode on impact, but were set with delayed fuses designed to detonate after the protecting concrete layers of the fortress had been penetrated. Shortly after the first rounds left the barrels of these monstrous guns, the report arrived from the observers that the fortress cupola had flown from its mounting. Maxim Gorky has been penetrated. The 305mm shells stored within the massive Russian battery began to explode, with huge fragments ricocheting wildly in the air. At last, the battery fell silent beneath a cloud of dust and smoke. The pioneer and infantry units assaulted the hill. Within the concrete colossus, which measured 300 meters long and 40 meters wide, the occupants continued to resist stubbornly. When the fall of the emplacement appeared inevitable, some of the defenders made a desperate attempt to break out in isolated groups. The pioneers worked their way into the defences with demolition charges, flamethrowers, and smoke canisters. After the initial explosion, the Soviets continued to fire from embrasures and openings in the concrete, but a second blast tore open a section of the wall. A giant cave was exposed to the pioneers, revealing the detailed complexity of the fortress. Maxim Gorky was 3 stories in depth, a self-sustaining city with water and electrical power, a hospital, a canteen, and machinery rooms with munitions carriers, arsenals, and manufacturing equipment. Each room and every entrance was barred by double steel doors, and to gain entry, every door had to be breached using demolition charges. The pioneers pressed themselves tightly against the walls in anticipation of the explosions, as they slowly worked their way deeper into the bowels of the concrete maze. As each door was blown open, the blast would be followed by hand grenades tossed into the smoke and gas-filled breach, followed by a momentary pause as they waited for the fumes to dissipate. Along the passageways lay the enemy dead, jumbled together in the darkness, the horrifying scene made even more surreal by the gas masks worn by the dead and dying. Hand grenades continued to burst within deafening proximity. Pistol shots cracked and whined through the confined spaces. After breaching a chamber, the intruders would be met by the slamming shut of a set of steel doors, and the process would begin anew. So it progressed, hour after hour, until the assault troops had penetrated deep within the fortress and were approaching the command centre. The Soviet Admiralty ordered the defenders to fight to the last man. There would be no surrender. An enemy radio man reported to Vice Admiral Oktyabrski in a bunker located near the Sevastopol harbour. "The Germans are pounding on the doors, demanding that we surrender. We can no longer open the portals to fire. There are only 46 of us remaining." 1/2 hour later, the Russians transmitted another message. "There are only 22 of us left. We are preparing to blow ourselves up and cease communications. Farewell." And so it ended. The heart of the fortress self-destructed with the enemy at the door, and the battle for Maxim Gorky was over. From a crew of more than 1,000 defenders, only 40 enemy personnel, too badly wounded to offer further resistance, fell prisoner to our forces. Maxim Gorky fell at 4:45 p.m. With the capture of this massive battery, the strongest enemy fortress along the north front of Sevastopol was in our hands. The backbone of the enemy defense system had been broken, and that evening our foremost line stood at the Shishkova position. Visibility over the battlefield was often hindered during the daylight hours because of the bombing missions flown by our aircraft. The observation point of the 1st Artillery Battalion was situated on the height 200 metres east of the tank trench. The 3rd Battery shifted positions, and at approximately 6 a.m. was again prepared for action northeast of the Neuhaus Heights. While on the Olberg, I observed a Junkers 88 as it received a vital hit from an enemy flak battery. One motor burst into flames, and the aircraft wound in a slow descent toward the north, a black plume of smoke tracing its path across the sky. While still over enemy-occupied territory, an object appeared to fall from the rear of the plane and drop for a short distance. Suddenly a white spot appeared against the sky, growing larger until one could recognize a white parachute swaying gently toward the earth, growing larger with each passing second, until it appeared that it would descend directly on us. The wind carried the crewmen toward us, but enemy flak batteries and Soviet infantrymen began to open fire on the slowly falling target. 2 of our machine gun crews sprang to their weapons and fired belt after belt of ammunition on the Russian positions in an attempt to suppress their fire. Directed by the forward observers, we opened fire with a pack, firing high-explosive rounds rapidly into the enemy positions, followed by mortars that added to the crescendo as the airmen approached the earth. With our fire, we successfully silenced the enemy guns for 20 or 30 seconds before the parachute swung over our position, and a crewman landed safely behind our lines with a bullet-riddled parachute. Several Lancers raced to his location and assisted him to his feet. Breathing heavily, he expressed his gratitude between gasps and assured the rescuers that he was unhurt, but was greatly relieved to have survived the harrowing experience and to have escaped capture, as the Russians were sitting in their positions only 100 meters distant. On another occasion, one of the non-commissioned officers recently transferred to the company as a replacement claimed to have been a professional dancer before being called into service. He was very proud of his fitness and his physical appearance, and always took extreme caution not to injure himself or to expose himself unnecessarily to danger. One afternoon, a shell fragment sliced away a sizable portion of his nose, and as I was bandaging his wound, he stated his intentions to apply for a government disability pension, as he was certain that with this disfigurement his career as a dancer was finished. We experienced rare occasions when individuals fresh to the front would surreptitiously creep along the earthworks, their hands held high in the air above the protection of the berm, in hopes of receiving a Heimatschuss to ensure a ticket home. In such an environment, solid, dependable citizens would sometimes react in an unpredictable and strange fashion, earning themselves a reputation that during the course of a normal life would never have been considered. The ranks of the rifle companies grew ever thinner. The days were sweltering with heat. The nights brought little relief. One lived only on cigarettes, cold coffee, tea, and the sparse battle rations that were issued daily to those in the foremost lines. It was impossible to wash regularly or to shave. The chalky earth absorbed any rainwater like a sponge, and where clear streams had run during the winter months, there were now bone-dry beds caked with red-brown, cracked clay. The demands placed on the Lancers in the front lines escalated to inhumane levels. In many of the actions, my pack could not be positioned to engage the enemy due to the heavy terrain, impassable to all except the infantrymen slogging forward on foot. Almost all the Soviet trench systems and defensive emplacements had to be combated singularly by the infantry and pioneer units as they made their way slowly through terrain cut with ravines, thick with heavy underbrush, and wrought with danger from enemy mines. The enemy would be engaged, the position would fall with losses to both sides, and the Lancers would advance to the next assigned objective. I received the assignment to secure the road that ran behind the Neuhaus Heights toward Maxim Gorky. During hours of darkness, when the advance would grind to a temporary halt, we assisted the infantry platoons in bringing forward ammunition and transporting the wounded to the rear. During the night of 16–17 of June, while at the headquarters of 2nd Battalion, 437th Regiment, I saw Hauptmann Bernhard for the last time. The next day he was killed in action while assaulting a position west of the Neuhaus Heights. The dead from both sides lay thick in the ravines, and due to the danger from enemy snipers they could not be removed or recovered for burial. The oppressive heat soon bore with it the sickly sweet smell of decaying flesh, and after only a few days the corpses were swollen to the extent that the seams on the uniforms split. The faces and hands of the dead turned black, the hands stiffly extended in the air from the swollen bodies, giving a more ghastly appearance to the corpses than even this nightmare would ordinarily present. A medical corpsman ventured between the lines to scatter chlorine over some of the corpses in a valiant attempt to lessen the stench and to help delay the onset of diseases. Despite the many months of constant exposure to death, I could never pass downwind of the ravines without being overwhelmed by nausea. On 19 and the 20th of June, our infantry regiments were withdrawn from the fighting, as the strength of the troops had declined to the point of being completely ineffective. One company listed only 2 Feldwebels and a few troops thus surviving in the ranks, and many of the company commanders had been killed or wounded with no immediate replacements available. The forward artillery observers had also taken heavy casualties, and many artillery personnel had fallen victim to counter-barrages from the highly effective Russian artillery. Added to this steady erosion in manpower were casualties among communications personnel, pioneers, and reconnaissance personnel from Aufklärungsabteilung 132. During the nights, the droning of the Ratas overhead continued without interruption, and often we would be showered with propaganda leaflets printed with a crude attempt to entice the Lancers to desert. One Soviet leaflet of June 1942 prompted, "Read and pass to your comrades. Soldiers of the 50th, 24th, 132nd, 170th, 72nd, and 28th Infantry Divisions. For 7 months your High Command has attempted to capture Sevastopol. This endeavour has cost you 80,000 dead, and the goal has not been reached, and it shall not be reached. In 4 days alone, your June offensive on the heights 64, 4, 192, 0, 104.5, and in other areas of Sevastopol has cost you 15,000 men in killed, wounded, or missing, and you have still been unsuccessful in breaking through the Russian defences. You shall continue to be unsuccessful. Russian naval and guard troops will continue to protect their homes, and will continue to line the approaches to the city with the graves of their enemies. German soldiers. While your blood continues to flow in streams from the heights of Sevastopol, your cities at home are coming under daily attack by thousands of heavy British bombers. Cologne, Essen, Bremen, Emden, Rostock, Lübeck, and other German cities are being reduced to piles of smoking rubble. Within days, the English-American forces will land on the continent, and the Second Front in Europe will begin to roll. The units of Marshal Timoschenko continue to hammer with destructive strikes upon the Hitler Army in the Southern Army sector, and soon the day will come when the only escape route from the Crimean Peninsula will be blocked. There will be no escape for you. You still have a choice of 2 possibilities: senseless destruction and death for the criminal and inhuman policy of Hitler, or to give yourself up to the defenders of Sevastopol in order to save your lives. Soldiers of the 11th German Army, refuse to participate in any further attacks. Desert from the foremost positions. Surrender and you shall survive. From the High Command of the Red Army. On the 18th of June, Infantry Regiment 436 moved into the northern area of Fortress Shishkova, while Infantry Regiment 437 gained the southwest corner of Bartenyevka. Infantry Regiment 437, greatly reduced in strength, was then pulled off the line and assigned to the 46th Infantry Division as coastal security on the Kerch Peninsula. On the 19th of June, Shishkova was fully occupied, and the 97th Infantry Regiment won further ground to the southwest. On the 20th of June, the strong point Lenin fell to that regiment, and on the next day the entire battery line was in the hands of the 97th and the Division Pioneers. With that success, the northern harbour had fallen to the 132nd Infantry Division. After fulfilling their assignment in the area north of Severnaya, the division was ordered to the left wing of the 54th Army Corps, and was ordered to push south through difficult terrain to Gaitani. The division headquarters, formerly located in the Seaman's Home, was transferred to the Serpentine, and on the 22nd of June to the Melza ravine north of Kamyshi. Infantry Regiment 436 was pulled out of the line following heavy losses and was transferred to the Kerch Peninsula to serve as coastal defence. It was replaced by the 72nd Infantry Regiment. By the 27th of June, the attacking forces were successful in penetrating the heavy bush area and capturing the heights of Gaetani in heavy infantry fighting. They then rotated to the left 90 degrees to occupy the long hill. With this move, the lines of the division were situated from east to west along the east bank of the Chernaya. The neighbouring division on the right was the 50th Infantry Division, with the 4th Romanian Mountain Division on the left. On the 27th of June, the division headquarters was transferred northwest to Cherkis-Kerman. An assault was again ordered for the 29th of June, involving forces from the 54th and the 30th Army Corps. From the forward division headquarters on Bastion 2, the entire movement of the attack could be observed across the Chernaya. Following heavy resistance, the German infantry units were able to capture the steeply sloped heights west of the Chernaya. With clear visibility, the observers were offered a spectacular view of storming infantry supported by assault guns and pioneers, and from this point they could observe the fleeing Russians as they were enveloped in an artillery blocking fire, with their motorized units suffering losses to Stuka attacks. 30 June brought more gains against ever-weakening enemy defences, and at midday the point elements of the division pushed into the area south of Sevastopol. With this gain in territory, the division headquarters was transferred to Inkerman Sud. On the 1st of July, heavy artillery barrages and bombing raids were ordered on the beleaguered city at 12:30. It was planned that the mass of the 54th Army Corps would take the eastern sector, and the 132 End Infantry Division was ordered to push from the south into the city's defences and capture the southern sector. The goal of the attack from the south was to capture the southernmost third of Sevastopol on the first day, with the remainder of the city to be taken on the second. At 9 a.m., the artillery and Luftwaffe bombardments were observed from the division headquarters, now located forward on Hill 73. The entire city appeared to have vanished beneath a thick blanket of smoke and dust. In the event that only light resistance would be encountered, the division commander requested approval to push through the city centre to the southern edge of the harbour, enabling the city to be taken in one day. This contingency plan was approved. The assault plan assigned the 42nd Infantry Regiment to the right flank and the 72nd Infantry Regiment to the middle, and the left flank, sweeping through the western approaches to Sevastopol, was assigned to the 97th Infantry Regiment. At 1230 p.m., it was possible to observe the forward infantry elements penetrate the outer defences of the city, and the artillery directed against the southern sector was lifted to prevent casualties to our own forces. At 1:13 p.m., the war flag of the Reich was hoisted above the commanding panorama heights, as the infantry, now encountering little or no resistance, continued a rapid advance. At 2 p.m., the division commander received a report from Oberst Meisel, commander of the 42nd Infantry Regiment, that his forces had penetrated beyond the line of defences, advanced through the city, and had reached Artillery Bay. With this report, the city was officially in German hands. The report was passed to the Corps commander and was immediately endorsed and forwarded to be made available for a special broadcast by Deutscher Rundfunk. At exactly 9 p.m., it was broadcast to the world that Sevastopol had fallen to German forces. Oberst Meisel was awarded the title First German Commander of Sevastopol by the division commander. The German forces pushed onward through the heart of the city, which in large part had been reduced to rubble. In many areas, the heat from burning buildings and bursting natural gas lines became so intense that even driving through the devastated streets was difficult. On the commanding features of the panorama heights overlooking the bay stood the General Graf Tottleben Memorial to the defender of the city during the Crimean War of 1853-1856. Despite having been damaged by an artillery shell that had beheaded the statue, it was removed by the division and sent to Berlin to be displayed as a trophy in the Zeughaus. The city's inhabitants slowly crawled from the cellars and underground shelters to greet their conquerors. Anxiously eyeing the German troops who moved in long columns at a snail's pace through the rubble, the surviving citizens immediately began plundering the food supply depots that had not been destroyed by artillery fire. Martial law was imposed as soon as possible to restore order to the tortured city. The supply depots and vital city facilities were put under guard, and labour crews were organised in efforts to resurrect life from the destruction that had descended on their world over the past weeks. After weeks of difficult fighting and heavy losses, Russia's strongest land and coastal fortress was now firmly in German hands. Over the next several days, the Lancers and Soviet prisoners set to work burying thousands of Russian dead, still lying scattered throughout the areas where heavy fighting had taken place. Some areas had experienced fanatical resistance. During the assault on Inkerman, an immense munitions depot built into a cliff was discovered. The huge facility had served as a Crimean wine processing and bottling factory before the war, and the Soviets had brought thousands of wounded soldiers and civilians seeking refuge into the massive complex for protection. As the German troops approached, demolitions charges placed earlier in the base of the cliff were detonated. With a thunderous roar, the 30-metre precipice collapsed along a length of 300 metres, sealing the entrance and burying all occupants beneath many tons of earth. Among the casualties were members of a German reconnaissance unit that had approached the facility and had reached the entrance when the charges were detonated. The merciless sun beat down on the city of Sevastopol, bringing sweltering heat with each sunrise. The city had suffered heavy damage from extended bombing and artillery barrages, but through the ruins one could see the beauty of what had once been there. Following destruction during the Crimean War in the 1860s, the Tsar had rebuilt the city in a late classical style. Many of the imposing facades had thus far survived this war and were still standing in exquisite beauty. The harbour facilities were destroyed, and half-sunken ships lay in the water with bows and sterns angling upward from a surface choked with oil and debris. Fires raged throughout the area, and in the streets Russian prisoners of war shovelled passages through the rubble. The battle for the Crimea was by no means complete. The Soviet coastal army had lost Sevastopol, but many of the forces escaped to new positions west of the city on the Cherson Peninsula. On orders from Stalin, they were to fight in these positions to the last man if evacuation was not possible. A small number of high-ranking commanders and commissars were successfully evacuated by patrol craft, including the former commander of Sevastopol, General Petrov. The heavy fighting on the Cherson Peninsula lasted until the 4th of July, 1942. Russian units continued in their attempts to break through the German lines to reach the partisan bands in the Yaila Mountains. In thick masses, with arms linked to prevent shirkers from breaking ranks and holding back, waves of survivors launched attacks against our lines, in the same manner that we had previously experienced at Mackenzie. Many of the suicidal attackers were women and girls from the Communist Youth Organization. These poorly trained and unprepared forces suffered extremely high casualties, and the last remaining groups surrendered on the 4th of July after an unsuccessful attempt to escape the encirclement through ravines and gorges. On the Cherson Peninsula alone, 30,000 prisoners were taken during these mopping-up operations. In the defeated city, the threat of disease remained great as myriad flies covered the dead and formed grey-black swirling clouds over the wounded. The walls of the quarters were carpeted with the disease's spreading insects, and eating became laborious as it was necessary to clear the clusters of vermin from each bite of food. Despite efforts to avoid ingesting the insects, many flies were consumed with no apparent ill effects. Even in peacetime, pestilence had descended on the city, brought to the Crimea by ship from Constantinople and into the harbours in the Caucasus. During our own siege, rats carrying bacillus virus had proliferated, but luckily the disease was kept in check. Without warning or explanation, the millions of flies soon succumbed to an epidemic that swept the area, and the flying vermin were mysteriously eradicated. The English cemetery served as a memorial to the First Crimean War. The Soviets had used the location as a command centre, and the marble monuments erected to the fallen English soldiers were broken and strewn amid the remains of the dead thrown from their graves by the artillery barrages. Numerous Russians lay wounded, scattered among the vineyards under a merciless, scorching sun. There was no water available to them where they lay, and they were quickly overcome with a sense of apathy as they lay waiting to die on the open ground. It became necessary for German medical personnel to attempt to save them, and Russian medical officers, nurses, and NCOs were brought from the prison compounds to assist in combing the hillsides in the search for wounded Red Army soldiers. The Russian doctors tore the rough wooden stakes from the ground and moved through the vineyards, using the poles as prods to persuade the ambulatory wounded to move to medical stations. For many who could not be persuaded with pokes and prods to rise to their feet, the doctors and medical personnel would spring among them, swinging the sticks wildly. With shouts and beatings, the walking wounded would be forced to their feet and steered in the direction of the medical stations. Leaning wearily against one another for support, covered with flies and wrapped in bloody bandages, the wounded would stumble in pairs or in small groups as they moved slowly toward their destination. Soon, long, pitiful columns were making their way under a glowing sun toward the wells and the prisoner of war enclosures, and for many it would be a final journey. Following the fall of the city, the division was assigned security duties on the Kerch Peninsula, where we were to remain until ordered to the Northern Front on the 27th of August, 1942. On the seacoast, within clear view of the Caucasus Mountains, the division was able to recuperate in relative luxury after months of grueling combat. There was swimming and organized recreation, broken intermittently by occasional guard duty and training sessions. At Yalta, on the southern coast of the Crimea, often referred to as the Russian Riviera, a recreation area was established. Here, in the warmth of the summer sun, and far from the shell bursts and the crack of the snipers' rifles, the Lancers sat for hours playing scat. 2 years later, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin held a conference in this pleasant city that would determine the fate of millions. The furlough restriction was rescinded, and a number of soldiers were permitted to take their earned departure from the front. I was elated to learn that I had been selected for this respite, and I soon boarded an overflowing furlough train toward Germany. Following my leave, I reported back to the regimental headquarters in Kerch. There I was advised that due to my participation in the action during which we destroyed the 3 Soviet tanks, I had been recommended and accepted for attendance at the Kriegsschule, war school, as an officer candidate. These carefree days in Yalta proved to be short-lived. The eastern migration of the German race and the victories of the Eastern gods now stood at its zenith, or so reported the propagandists. The propaganda units declared that finally the dream, the idea of world domination, would now be coming to fruition. But then the victorious Eastern warriors took a furlough. Out of the sterile environment of the front, they journeyed to the homeland, where they began to hear rumours of questionable actions committed by the Reich, and occasionally fantastic stories would circulate of the policies of political operatives far behind the lines in occupied territories. The soldiers returned to the front, often dissatisfied and sometimes disillusioned, as they came to realize that their experience in war had altered them forever. They had learned that in Germany they were no longer at ease, that the friends and comrades of their units had become the family, and that the war had become their life. By summer 1942, the German armies had pushed the distance from the Don and Kuban to the Caucasus. They had reached the coasts of the Caspian Sea and the banks of the Volga. The name Stalingrad was already often heard, with no indication of what lay in the future for the Sixth Army on the Volga. It had been initially planned that the Crimean Army would cross the Straits of Kerch, push through the Caucasus, and swing north to launch a planned offensive in coordination with the German southern wing. This plan was changed by Hitler, the man at the forefront of our command in Berlin, who was now occasionally referred to as the greatest warlord of all time. The capture of Sevastopol by the divisions of the 11th Army had stirred within Hitler the idea to use these divisions in the storming of Leningrad. Thus, the absurd plan to remove the core of the Crimean divisions from the southernmost point of the German advance and shift them to the northernmost part of Russia was put into motion. The urgent need for these forces to remain anchoring the southern flank of the Eastern Front was brushed aside. Perhaps the fate of the Sixth Army in Stalingrad could have been averted if the experienced Crimean divisions had remained on the southern wing.